So welcome to those UMOchurch.tv. So I don't want to brag, but my last 2 years of high school, I worked at McDonald's. And I just want you to know who's talking to you this morning. I worked pretty much every position you could work. I worked the grill, flipping the burgers. I worked the front, register. I worked the drive-through in the register there. I was a crew trainer. I don't want to brag, but I had a pin for it, went in my hat. And, it was pretty sweet. But just, again, I wanted you to know who's talking to you this morning. And so my senior year of high school, I think first quarter, I think it was in the fall, like October, I was leaving McDonald's, and I only lived about 2.5 blocks away from McDonald's. It was like McDonald's was on a main road in Toledo, Ohio, and you basically just cross the street and then start going down the side roads to get a couple blocks into the blocks where I lived. And so I left one night, and it was when McDonald's closed at 10 or 11 p.m., and it was a weeknight. I remember that. And I left, and I crossed the main street that it was on, West Sylvania Avenue, and I started heading down a side street. And I was just tired. I've got my McDonald's hat on and my sweet McDonald's polo and my black pants that are splattered with hamburger grease and my black work shoes that are covered and caked with grease. And I'm walking. I got my head down, and I was doing like a slow diagonal crossing of the street. So it was almost like I was walking in the middle of the street for a few minutes. And I looked up a little bit too late to see that there were 8 kids walking in the middle of the road coming toward me. Now, immediately I could kind of tell by their size, they were probably like 9th and 10th graders, and I was a 12th grader. So they were a little bit younger than me, but there was about 8 of them. And it was a little bit too late to just like really not be obvious. So like, oh, crud, like I'm moving this direction. So I kind of looked up and like, oh, no. And as they walked toward me, the people right in front of me, they kind of slowed down and stopped several feet from me. And the others just kind of wrapped around me. And so it was like, yeah, first off, as you look up and you see a bunch of wannabe thugs walking like young guns together, up the hill, like spaced out, or whatever. Like, okay, this already looks like you're making a statement how you're walking down the middle of the street. And then they wrap around me. And then slowly but surely, like they start closing in on me. The circle does. And I feel like the woman in the Thriller video for Michael Jackson back in the day. She's like the zombies are coming in on her and she's looking around, whatever. But I remember just being like, oh man, like I'm dressed in a McDonald's outfit and I'm exhausted. I'm covered in grease. My feet hurt from my shift. And now I'm literally surrounded by the Backstreet Boys. And so I remember, like, the one moment I really remember is when the guy to 10 o'clock, my front left, the guy to 10 o'clock, as they're moving in, just slowly picks up the pace, and he's the one coming in first. And I was like, oh, man, here we go. Now, just take that image, that feeling for just a second, which, I don't know, the feeling for me was like, I am surrounded, and something is about to go down. The feeling for you might be like, man, I hope Dan gets his butt kicked. Okay, I don't know what the feeling, but feel that feeling is surrounded. Now, some of you feel that feeling in life, sometimes all the time as you walk through life. Others, there's seasons in and out of it, where I just kind of feel surrounded. Whether I literally am or not, I feel kind of surrounded by hostility. I feel surrounded by enemies, and that can come in so many forms. It could be maybe you're the only Christian in your family, the only person in your family who's trying to follow Jesus, and you just feel like you're surrounded. And it might be exaggerated even more in a sense during Thanksgiving. Like when it's extended family that gets together and you're the only person that's a follower of Jesus. Sometimes, I relate to this. Sometimes your family finds a way to throw in random barbs that are directed toward your faith, and you're different, and you act different. You value things differently than us, and oh, that's probably an issue for him or her. And you're like, oh, man, and it just feels more like, man, I am surrounded and the walls are closing in. Or maybe you're the only Christian at your workplace, and just every once in a while, there's a worker that in front of other workers might highlight how much you stick out because you won't contribute or, be a part of this. You won't go to this place with them on a business trip or after work. You don't. And there's just this like, man, I am so alone here and I'm surrounded. And at times it gets kind of hostile. Or maybe, you are, or at least you feel like you are the only person of faith in your middle school or high school. And you're just like, man, I'm sure there are other people sprinkled around this school who love Jesus, But I happen to love Jesus, and man, I feel alone in this school a lot. And when I go out in those halls between class, I feel surrounded and sometimes in hostility to you're different. Like you think and believe differently than we do. And so I know a lot of like college students often feel surrounded when they go and are like, I'm in a college campus or a state school. And sometimes I feel just like the students and the teachers or the professors, they really have a way different view than I do of life. And at times, like I'm out in the crowd and they're just taking shots at people of faith, whether they know I am one or not. Or maybe it could even be just that as a follower of Jesus, for those of you who are, I know we have a very mixed crowd at Momentum, is like people who are followers of Jesus sometimes can feel just in culture, just in general, like, man, I am surrounded by, and it can feel like just surrounded by people who feel totally different than me on so many hot button issues that, man, it just feels like sometimes the walls are closing in and I am surrounded. And I feel like I'm wearing a McDonald's hat that has a 2-year crew trainer pin on it, and just like that the walls are closing in. And sometimes it isn't literal, but even sometimes it just can feel like that's what it is. I feel surrounded and alone, and I just feel like the walls are closing in. So turn to Psalm 57. We have been this third week in a series called NMEs, and it's really about some psalms in the Bible, which are written prayers or poems or songs. And the ones that we're covering are written by a guy named David, and he wrote a lot of psalms or prayers or songs about his enemies, or with his enemies in the backdrop or in the foreground, like it's there. And so we're in Psalm 57. So I want you to picture this like a ketchup bottle, Heinz 57, that if you hit the psalm just right, you'll get a message out of it, okay? So go to Psalm 57. This is, again, about David living in a world of drama and strife and opposition. And it says in Psalm 57, to begin the inscription or the superscription, it says, for the director of music to the tune of Do Not Destroy. Scholars think that might have been like a melody that this eventually, when it was used in worship, would have been sang to. And so of David wrote this. A miktam, which we don't really know. We've lost the meaning of what this musical term means. But then here's key context. When he had fled from Saul into the cave. So this is the context that David, this is about a time and an experience where the king of Israel, the first king of Israel, who wasn't such a great guy at this time in his life, hates David and wants him dead. He's jealous of David. And so last week, this was the context also. David was on the run, and he was on the run from King Saul. So at this time, we're like, now this could be two instances that we know of, at least that are recorded in Scripture. 1 Samuel 22 talks about a time where David hides in a cave in Adullam, southwest of Jerusalem. Then the other time, which if you've read through 1 Samuel is probably the more vivid picture, is a time where in 1 Samuel 24, it's a really cool and interesting story, but David's in a cave near En-Gedi, and this time King Saul has to relieve himself, and he goes into a cave unknowing that David is in there hiding because Saul's pursuing him with his people. And so David's hiding in this cave, and Saul, by happenstance, comes into that cave to relieve himself. And so, David is in there hiding, and he could have easily killed Saul, but instead he says, man, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. He's God's chosen king. Like, even if he's evil, even if he's trying to kill me, who am I to take out the guy that God has made king? I'm going to let God do that. I'm not going to be in that business to kill him myself. And so we don't know what the situation is, but we know that David's on the run from Saul and he's in a cave. And so, but the interesting thing is before this whole fugitive thing happens, the way David knows that Saul doesn't like him is they're having dinner one day and Saul chucks a couple spears at David's head. And Dave's like, I think that's a clue he doesn't like me. And so he hits the road, goes out to run. But Jonathan, Saul's son, the crown prince, who's a very, very close friend of David, they have a talk before David goes on the run. And one of the things I just think is interesting in the picture here is David says to Jonathan, as surely as the Lord lives, there is only one step between me and death. Think about David's life. And if I make one wrong move, if I take one misstep, I'm dead. your dad, the king, he has the resources and the people. If I make one wrong move, he's going to kill me. That'll be my last move. So that is tension. That is stress. That's what David lives with, surrounded by enemies, on the run from enemies. And so here we go, verse 1. Have mercy on me, he prays, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. So feeling the context of what is going on, picture these words being prayed or sang by David to God. Now, enemies are threatening. What he seeks is refuge, a place of safety from this danger. And this is another psalm where David is writing about the stress of dealing with enemies. And here, he kind of casts himself as a fledgling bird protected by its mother. And this image of hiding under the protective spread divine wings of God is actually used several times in Scripture and often even in the book of Psalms. So last week we talked about in Psalm 56 that David was running for his life and he sought asylum in a really bizarre, hostile city called Gath. Now he's not running for his life at the moment. He's hiding for his life in a cave, and he's seeking asylum here in the cave. But it's almost like David has learned this cave isn't safe asylum. Like this cave could be a trap as much as it is a refuge. I could be trapped here. If they figure out I'm in here, I'm done. And so he's like, the only real refuge I have, God, is in you. It's not this cave. It's in you, like under your wings. And so he's seeking asylum now in the Lord, not a city, not even the cave, but I'm seeking asylum in you. The scholar Derek Kidner writes this. He says, where most men would have named the cave as their refuge, David saw beyond it. Solid rock by itself could be a trap as easily as a stronghold. So the wings of God are a really cool metaphor that's used many times in Scripture. In fact, it's just this familiar picture of a mother bird protecting her young by spreading her wings over them, by kind of pulling them in, protecting them from the elements. Maybe it's rain, and she protects them from the rain. Maybe it's the sun, and she protects them from the heat. Maybe it's predators, and she protects them from the enemy. And so she pulls them in under her wings. And if we could just meditate on that for a moment and think about that image, I'm going to give you 3 other places where it's mentioned, just to kind of envision this. Psalm 36:7 says this, how priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. Psalm 61:14 says, I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. And then Psalm 91 uses similar image. It says, whoever dwells in the shadow of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. So the vast majorities of metaphors that God reveals to us in Scripture, in Revelation, which is Scripture, it's God-breathed, God-revealed from the mind of God, are often images like king and father, like overwhelmingly masculine images. But here is this occasional evoking of God, of God as a mother bird. And it pops up, multiple times. And so it's like, there's so many reasons for it. One, it's because God doesn't have a Y chromosome. It's not like he's literally male, or whatever. But he describes and reveals himself as a father. And one of the reasons might be to, understand, you might think of God as remote and distant, which some human fathers can be. And when you've got those father things, you're like, huh. And then you get this picture of like this mother bird, like pulling you in. And you're like, man, that evokes other images of what God, who he truly is. And so this is a God who will be protective, a God who will be nurturing. And there's some images, like the things the image stands for. I'll give you 2 of them. There's 3 of them. I'll make you earn the 3rd one. I'll give you 2 right now. The first one is strength and protection. Like, this shows the strength of the mother bird and the protection that I would pull you under my wings to protect you and to shield you. And then the second thing, of course, tenderness and love. Like, this is this nurturing aspect of God that is so there, and it is in the Father image, no doubt. But man, it's hard to miss it when it's like this mother who will do anything she can to protect the young and pull them under her wings. And so the image doesn't mean that David's going to escape, from all harm or any suffering in his life. No, he's never guaranteed of that. God never says he will protect us from trouble, more that he will protect us in trouble. He will walk with us in the midst of trouble during a whole lot of things in this world that are not his will, but the world has rebelled against him. You have done things, I have done things to hurt others. We're all doing things to hurt one another in this world, and God is like, this is not what I planned for this world, and I won't protect you from trouble, but I will protect you in trouble. I will walk with you in this world through this trouble. So at the end of that first verse, there is one thing that I love. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. Like, notice that perspective David has. The disaster is probably an image for like a really bad storm. In fact, the Message paraphrase of this verse says, I'm hiding out under your wings until the hurricane blows over. Like, the whole idea is that if you have strife and conflict and stuff going on with people that don't like you, especially I'm talking about people who don't like you because of your faith or whatever, then the idea of your problem with your enemies, it's like a violent storm. And when you need refuge from your enemies and that stress, remind yourself, this too will pass. This storm will eventually pass. Some faster than others, but it will pass. And so David's like, I will find safety and protection and refuge in you until the disaster has passed, because it will pass. And David has the perspective to be like, man, I know I'm in the storm right now, but the storm isn't always going to be going on. It won't always be happening. Conflict doesn't last forever. Usually your enemies don't pursue you your entire life. Usually there's a season that's happening. You won't be surrounded every moment of every day. When I was in my sweet McDonald's getup, and the circle's closing in on me slowly, like the Thriller video, and I'm like, oh boy, what is going to happen here or whatever. And the guy at 10 o'clock starts moving in a little bit quicker. I don't know if it was like the street lights that were back there that just hit at the right moment or whatever, but right when he was getting pretty close to me, all of a sudden he stopped and he went, oh, hey guys, that's not him. Oh, okay, boom. And they scattered like roaches. They were gone. I was like, ah! Ah! Like, my heart was beating so fast. And it all happened in like 20 seconds, because when I looked up, it's like, oh, they're here. Okay, I don't know these guys. Oh, they're surrounding me. Awesome. All right, guys coming in from 10 o'clock. And it's like, oh, hey, guys, that's not him. And I'm like, who were they looking for? And why did they think he was going to be wearing a McDonald's outfit? Some Scottish enemy that they were really wanting to slice up, really. I have no idea. And if you're a guy, your brain is sick. I have thought so many times about that moment looking back. I'm like, how many of those freshmen and sophomores could I have taken out before it was over? Before they ended up, any guys that are with me on that, like, I daydream about, like, come on, I at least would have wrecked 2 or 3 of those freshmen, sophomores, as a senior before I would have got my butt kicked by the other 5, or whatever. So that's just, it's too many Karate Kid movies as a kid, or whatever. But it's like, woo! Okay, so, some storms pass quicker. The danger disappears and dissipates quicker than other times. Sometimes there are like things that happen and you're in danger and it goes away so quickly, honestly, that it's not like you even look back on that many times the rest of your life and be like, God, thank you, you rescued me from that situation. Like, God, thank you. That could have been a misunderstanding that they realized 3 minutes into a fight. Like, wait a minute, the dude, we can barely recognize him now, but I don't think it's him. He didn't work 2 years at McDonald's. He only worked a year there. This guy's way more veteran, These pins really give away, like if you wipe the blood off them. So some storms pass quickly and you're just like, man, God, I barely remember how much trouble I was in or how much stress I was in last year right now. But that storm went away quickly. And then there's others, like a theme through this series is, I talk about how I was terrorized by my stepdad growing up in my home. And, to be honest, eventually I was college age and I moved out. And that season sucked, and I was strengthened through it, and I had to rely on God like no other season of my life. But eventually I moved out, and I knew that season, that storm, that hurricane is kind of over now. I'll have to walk through it every once in a while at Thanksgiving and Christmas. But that storm, for the most part, it blew by. And then my stepdad passed away 10 years ago last month. And man, I didn't rejoice when he died. I was kind of like, man, what a sad life this guy lived. He didn't know how to love or be loved. But I knew that's a storm that's over. Unless I'm going to rethink stuff and harbor anger and bitterness, that storm is over. It blew past. It lasted longer than I would ever have wanted it to last when I was a teenager and a kid. But David's like, man, God, I need to hide in you under the shadow of your protective, motherly wings. I need to hide in you until it blows over, because it will blow over. This too will pass. Verse 4, we kind of get explicitly what's given to us in that inscription before verse 1. We kind of get implicitly this picture of what David's feeling. He says, I am in the midst of lions. I am forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. So he's saying, I am surrounded. I am in the middle of a bunch of lion-like enemies. It's like I'm thrown into a lion's den where now I'm surrounded by enemies, and I feel the stress that they're all around me. They're all around me. They're moving in on me. And so he's like someone who's been thrown into a lion's den. And if you feel that way, especially about your faith in any situation, whether it's your home, school, culture, or whatever it is, man, I feel so alone, like I'm surrounded by enemies that would rejoice at any time I stumble, that would rejoice at any time that I feel like I fail, whatever. He feels that right now. I'm one step away from death, and I'm surrounded by lion-like enemies. Fall of 97, Shannon and I were pretty newly married and had moved to Washington, D.C., the Virginia suburbs of D.C., and I started teaching her NFL rules, and she started loving the NFL. And so we decided to go to our first NFL game together. And it was 49ers. I grew up a 49ers fan. I've adopted as my second team the Browns. So this is proper godly attire this morning for a key victory we need today with a guy who's 14 years old at quarterback, DTR. But hey, come on, DTR. You can do it, dude. So anyways, I digress. But I'm a 49er fan, have been since I was in middle school, and so we were going to go see the Niners at Philly. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Philly, they're an unruly bunch when it comes to football. There's a famous episode, if you're not a fan of sports, where they booed Santa Claus in Old Veterans Stadium in Philly. They booed Santa Claus, okay? Philly people are going straight to hell. So we decided we're going to make our first NFL game going to Philly. So I think Shannon was the one. She's usually the one that does the business transactions in her home. She's like, I can get us 2 tickets. We can go see the game, but we won't be sitting together. And I was like, oh, wow, there's no 2 tickets together that I can find, oh man, well, would you want to go if you have to sit by yourself? She's like, oh, I'm in. I was like, I love this woman. So we'll be in the same row, ironically, but several sections away from each other. And so it's really funny. I don't think I can see her. No, that's Carrot Top. I don't know. That's not her at all. So we go to the Philly game. It's Monday Night Football. It was really, really cool. But in the first quarter, running back for the Eagles, Ricky Waters, gets hit and he fumbles and the ball's loose, and the Niners safety, Merton Hanks, scoops it up, runs it for a touchdown, scoop and score. And so we're like, oh my gosh. And Merton Hanks, he was this funny safety who, whenever he celebrated a turnover or a touchdown on defense, he did this chicken dance thing, and he had 3 extra vertebrae in his neck because I couldn't believe what he could do with his neck whipping around. And so he celebrated the scoop and score, and I jumped out, yes! I went nuts, man. And all these Philly fans in green sitting down around me, just angry. And some dude, late in the first quarter, was getting in my face from behind me, blah, 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 and bleep, and you're as dumb as Santa Claus, and just getting in my face, just tearing me up or whatever. And I was just ignoring, I'm smiling, I'm loving it, I'm enjoying the game. Finally, I just eventually gave the score, but he wouldn't go away, so I just kept pointing to the scoreboard. And he had some liquid confidence, so he had to follow my finger. He's like, Well, the game was great, but afterward, I did get Steve Young's autograph on my Steve Young jersey and Coach Steve Mariucci's autograph. So it was super cool for our first NFL game. But my wife is so godly and wise. She knew to not tell me till after the game when Merton Hanks had that scoop and score, which she didn't know that phrase quite yet because that would have been really attractive. But she learned it later. She was like, when Merton Hanks scored that touchdown, that fumble recovery, she goes, I jumped up, was like, yes! And a guy next to me, a Philly fan, hit me in the shoulder and said, sit down. And she went, okay. And she sat down, and I was like, oh, it is so good you didn't tell me that between first and second quarter when I came to visit you in your section. You know, it's like, oh, man. But you probably know the feeling. A lot of you know the feeling of what it feels like to be the visitor in the stadium. I mean, you are always marked because you're dressed in away team clothes, you're cheering for away team things, and when you celebrate, people want to punch you. Like, you're not celebrating things that they would want to celebrate. And man, that is so what it feels like at times. It's what David's describing. I feel like I'm surrounded by a pack of lions, and they all want me dead. And there's just so many times in this world where you just feel like, oh man, I am a fan in the away team's stadium. And when there's losses, I've got the long 5-mile walk of shame back to the car. You know, when you're in the away stadium, it's like, oh man, and I'm rocking this jersey for a long walk back to the car. And everybody's in your face about it. But you, man, as a person of faith, if you are one, you can feel that so many times. There's so many things that happen where it's like, here comes the walk of shame for the person of faith. Like, yep, I really stand out in this situation. It's the walk of shame, the walk of shame. It feels so lonely sometimes. And that is exactly what David's saying in this cave. God, I need your protective, nurturing love because I just feel overwhelmed by the hostility toward me right now. And so David takes refuge in God, surrounded by enemies, reminding himself that I need to be surrounded by you in the shadow of your wings. And what he does in this prayer is he essentially says, I'm surrounded by lions, but what he's saying is it may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, God. That's a worship song that we sing. It may look like I'm surrounded, but really, I'm surrounded by you, and I can take comfort in the shadow of your wings. In verse 6, he gives a full account of like what his enemies are up to, how they're trying to make his life miserable. He's like, they spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress, almost like my neck was being forced down, is what some scholars say to describe that Hebrew phrase. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves, he says. We talked about this last week in the previous psalm, but God makes it clear. This isn't some formulaic thing where it happens in every situation, but generally, God says, evil plans return on evil people like a boomerang. And you don't have to get involved. You don't have to touch the boomerang, get involved in the boomerang. You just stay back, stay out of it, and say, I am not going to try to get revenge. I've got my ex-boyfriend's password. Oh, I'm going to get in there and do some awesome stuff in his account. You know, before I'm going to change things. No, I'm just going to step back and I'm going to say, evil plans return on evil people like a boomerang. And as followers of Jesus, we don't fire back. We just say, I'm going to let divine irony take place. They dig a pit. They might just fall in it themselves. I'm not even praying for that to happen. I'm just letting God handle the situation. And if it doesn't happen in this life, God's like, there will always be justice for evil. There will always be justice for evil. So we patiently wait for God and say, God will avenge, but it won't be me doing it. I'm not going to be the one to cut Saul's throat in the cave. I'm going to let God handle this however he's going to work it out. And so God's faithful. It's two sides of a coin. If you put trust in God and you're like, God, I want to faithfully follow you, one side of the coin is that God's faithful are ultimately delivered, and the other side of that coin that can't be separated is that the ungodly are ultimately judged. And that act of salvation does both of those things at once usually. People are delivered, people are judged. And so the element of the psalm that is easy to slip by that I think is really encouraging is in verse 2, where David says, I cry out to God Most High, to God, who vindicates me. And so, of course, vindicate just means to clear me from accusation, to clear me from suspicion. Well, one of the versions in English, the English Standard Version, it's a very literal translation, just trying to be as accurate as it can, even if it makes the English rough in the translation. But it says this, and this isn't a rough translation, but it says, I cry out to God Most High, who fulfills his purpose for me. Or this is the New Living Translation, I cry out to God Most High, who will fulfill his purpose for me. And this is so encouraging and comforting, because if you're in a time right now where you're dealing with people that you feel like are hostile towards you, here's one thing is, have you ever thought in the midst of those situations, like, dang it, oh no, my enemy is going to ruin everything for me? Or like they're going to spread lies and spread their side of the story. They're going to change people's minds about who I am, or they're going to misrepresent me, or they're going to get me in trouble at school, or make people hate me, or get me fired, or ruin my reputation, or they're going to take away my right to see my children, or destroy this company that I've built. And verse 2 kind of reminds us, even in the face of enemies and storms and hurricanes and disasters, God has purposes that cannot be frustrated or derailed. He's like, man, what's he say? I cry out to God Most High, who will fulfill his purpose for me. So if God has some like purposes for you, places he's determined to get you, ways he's determined to use you, then stuff that your enemies are doing or plotting or scheming or saying with their words, they aren't going to get you off that track just because they're in there meddling. Now, I'm not saying that you can't derail yourself. Certainly, there are certain things that you could do or that I could do that would disqualify me from certain types of ministry. Like, man, now that I've done that, now that I have that on my record, there's certain ways I can't serve. That's absolutely true. But there's nothing that enemies are going to do to get in there and mess with me that God's going to be like, dang, how do I get her to where I want her to be now? Because God can either stop a plot from your enemies in motion, or he's a master chess player who can be like, whatever, I can work around that. I can still get them to the purpose that I want them to accomplish. And so when your enemies surround you or slander you or plot or scheme or attack, take comfort in if God has a plan that he wants to fulfill in your life, his divine plan will not be undermined by the plots and the attacks of your enemy. Don't get worried like, oh no, now my purpose in life can't be fulfilled because of what they're saying, what they're doing. God has the power to accomplish whatever he wants to accomplish in your life. He is unstoppable in that way. Like if there's something I want you to do or a position I want to get you in, I will get you in that position. Romans 8:28 famously says it this way. We know that in all things, good, bad, whatever, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Meaning, even when terrible things are done to you that aren't God's will, he can work all things to be like, okay, I'm still going to use this for my purpose. I'm going to take this bad, dark thing that I didn't want to happen, and I'm going to be like, master chess player, this is how I'm going to get it to work out in a way that brings growth and goodness, in a way that your dark story of stuff that you've been through will have a positive impact on others who are going through similar things later. I can work this out. My purpose will not be frustrated. And the psalm ultimately ends with, funny enough, thanksgiving. So the first 6 verses are David praying in a cave. Verses 7 through 10 are David decides to worship in a cave. And basically, like many other psalms, this is like a general psalm of what we would call in a religious word supplication, where he's like, I'm praying about general stuff and asking for things, God. But now he gets to a point where he's like, now I just want to thank you. And scholars say this becomes a thanksgiving psalm at this point. And at verse 7. Verse 8, he says, awake my soul, awake harp and lyre. Those are 2 stringed instruments. I will awaken the dawn. And the beautiful picture there is Jewish scholar Robert Alter. He says, in these beautiful words, the speaker, David, imagines himself rising before daybreak with his stringed instruments to rouse the sleeping dawn with his songs. And so the image here is like maybe that David has spent the entire night praying in distress about his enemies. And with the break of day, like his faith and trust in God have finally triumphed. And basically the spiritual battle has been won as the sun is rising again. Like, okay, I just got to trust God that I'm under his protection and that he has a purpose in this moment and in this season. So, this Thanksgiving, maybe that's one thing many of you or many of us who are followers of Jesus, for example, can express gratitude for is, God, like I said earlier, has protected us many times through many situations, sometimes from enemies that have surrounded and threatened us. And sometimes he's taught us lessons through it. Like we can look back with clarity now and be like, man, that was a really bad season, but God did teach me this lesson from it. Or he used it to strengthen me, or he protected me in the shadow of his wings. Like that was a dark time, but I've never been more aware of God's presence than in that time. In fact, I don't feel him much now, but then I really sensed his presence then when I was going through that time. And thank God that we still breathe his air in our lungs. Like I've been in a lot of threatening situations, but I'm still here. I'm alive. And so there are times when, like I said, we prayed for protection and God gave us protection and we completely forgot. We walked away scot-free. And to be like, man, God, you've had my back in a lot of situations, and to be thankful for that. I mentioned that there were three things that the image of the mama bird basically brings up, and I gave you two of them. But one of them that remains as a major theme throughout the history of God in the world and Christianity, and that is, so first is strength and protection, second is tenderness and love. The third is this word substitution. Okay, so the mother bird is spreading her wings over her young to protect her young from the rain or the sun or predators. And so you might say, well, how does she protect her babies from the rain? Well, she gets wet instead of her young. How does she protect her babies from the sun? She gets hot and absorbs the heat instead of the young. How does she protect herself from predators or the babies from predators? Well, she gets bitten or gets eaten instead of her babies when she protects them. And so she puts herself between the bad and her young. And so there's only one time that's interesting where Jesus identifies himself as the mother bird. It's recorded twice, two different perspectives, but it's in Matthew 23 or paralleled in Luke 13. And he's going into the city of Jerusalem and he's talking about judgment. And he's actually saying, man, judgment is coming. Like people pay for their selfishness. People pay for their evil. And judgment is coming. And he's saying to Jerusalem, you're going to be judged for your sins and your wrongdoing. Judgment is coming down. And then, as he's talking about judgment, this is what he famously says. Matthew 23:37. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her hicks. Yeah, a bunch of country people and rubes. People from Lodi. All of them, okay? So, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. And so this is really interesting because the scene is very sweet. It's Jesus saying, I've longed to gather you like a mother hen under my wings. And, the urban people, the suburban, the hicks, all of them, just pull them in. But he's talking about judgment in the context. In the context, he's saying, if you believed in me, I would be your mother bird so that you could take shelter under my wings from what? From judgment. The whole context is about, man, Jerusalem, you've killed the prophets, you've rejected the things God has wanted to say to you. Man, how I've wanted to gather you and protect you from judgment. And so how? That means I want judgment to fall on me instead of you. You catching this? I want it to fall on me instead of you. I've longed to gather you, but you're not willing. And so ultimately, this is how God protects us in the shadow of his wings. This week I was doing some research, and man, I'm telling you, I had a killer story for this sermon. I've had it for years, waiting in my sermon illustration, this huge doc I have of stories. And I was working on it this week, and I went to look up a specific detail, and a Snopes link came up. And I was like, oh no, this story isn't true. Snopes kind of checks the validity. I was like, crap, the story's not real. And integrity, I had to cut the story. I was like, it was so good. It was too good to research, And so it's like, dang it, man. But then I found a fictional story that was basically parallel that I was like, oh, this one is fiction, but basically says the same thing. And is that back in 1945, there were these 13 little pamphlets that were written and put out by Christian teachers called the Illustrated Gospel series. And one of the pamphlets was called The Little Red Hen. And on it is just this simple story meant to convey the good news of Jesus to us, that there is this farm that catches on fire, and there's a mother hen living on the farm. And so while the fire catches and the flames engulf the farm, that the self-sacrificing mother hen gathers her chicks under her to protect her, therefore preserving the life of these chicks that gather under her wings. And so the reason that the chicks live, of course, in this fire is because the heat came upon them, but they were shielded by their mother. They were protected, and she let the fire come down on herself. And the whole point is basically to say that when Jesus came into the world, he came into a world that rebelled against him. God in the flesh, he's surrounded by hostility and enemies. When he goes to the cross, he's surrounded by enemies, even when he's on the cross. People who betrayed him, were denying him, that abandoned him, were mocking and jeering at him. And in the greatest act of love in history, Jesus stayed on the cross for his enemies surrounding him. And metaphorically, he was burned to a crisp for us by the judgment of God. Just to say, I want to take the judgment for you if you would come under my wings. He was burned by the fire of God, the wrath of God. He took what we deserved. That's what the Bible teaches, substitution. And that's the answer to understanding the whole image of refuge in Psalm 57 in its ultimate form is if we don't come under the wings of King Jesus, of Mother Hen Jesus, if we won't allow him to gather us under his wings, then we take the heat on our own for our own rebellion, for our own sin. And Jesus is saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Dan, Dan, friend, friend, I've longed to gather you. I want to take that heat. I want to take the fire for you. And if you believe in him and allow him to gather you under his protective wings, he absorbs the judgment through the cross so that you and I can live. Jesus, when we're in the middle of our suffering and feeling surrounded over, we can say, Jesus, I see the way that you suffered like that for us. So when I'm in the midst of some suffering and some pressure and some hostility around me, I can suffer right now with patience because of the way that I've seen you suffer. Let's pray.